Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Week 6. Oh, my goodness. Welcome back, Concordia University, Irvine students. Welcome back, HLMG 425, Financial Management of Health Services Organization. Yes, I am still here, your professor, Dr. Dale Gooden. Feel free to call me Dr. D, of course. Oh, it has been such a pleasure and a privilege teaching these courses. And, I can't think of anything else that I would rather be doing. So, God is good, and I'm so glad to have this opportunity. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me these 6 weeks. I know this course hasn't been easy for you. For some of you that are already in healthcare right now, I want you to empathize a little bit because you have your own clinical language that no one outside of the clinical space understands. And guess what? Finance is the same way. Unless you're enthralled into finance, it's really a foreign language. And people that aren't privy to that language don't really understand it. And so now you can start to have empathy for non-clinical people when they come into your world. You can hopefully start having some empathy for them now, as you can certainly see how challenging it is to grapple with these ideas in the financial management of health services organization. And again, these last 3 weeks, we are building some tough concepts here: strategic planning last week, and now capital budgeting that we'll talk about here in week 6. And all of these go hand in hand with each other. They're just the opposite sides of the same coin, or, even if you look at the Rubik's Cube, right? What do you have? 4 sides, something like that on the Rubik's Cube. That's how this thing is. Finance involves accounting, economics, corporate strategy, budgeting. They all kind of work hand in hand. And so starting on chapter 15 in the introduction to financial management of health services organizations, we're going to continue that process by talking about capital budgeting. And so we're going to understand the importance of capital budgeting, explain the types of capital budgeting. We are going to look at the steps of capital budgeting, the methods of capital budgeting expenditures, and the methods used to evaluate the capital budgeting process. And just like in strategic planning, these are best practices, but each organization does it differently. For those of you that aren't working, but when you do step into the healthcare space and you begin to see a delta between what you've learned in the textbooks and what actually is happening on the ground within those organizations, some of them may or may not be best practices that you see happening within your health services organization. Depending on where you are in that process, you can affect it. Especially if you are a manager or higher, and certainly in the C-suite, you have an obligation to make sure that your organization is doing the best practices. And sometimes that is so tough because you have people in organizations that have been there for 20 or 30 years, and that's all they know is the process that they know. And anyone that comes in from the outside to try to buck the process, there's usually a lot of pushback as a result of that. So I'm just going to leave it at that. So again, when we talk about capital budgeting, we have to know what the capital costs are. Again, when we talk about capital, In some organizations, that capital expenditure is as little as $1,000. Some organizations is $10,000. So each organization will determine what their capital costs are or what their capital expenditures are. But in the introduction on page 336, it talks about land, building, and equipment. So these are huge capital expenditures that usually involve some type of financing that will take decades to either meet the lease or uh, pay off the land, if you will. And we've talked about this already a little bit there when we looked at direct cost and indirect costs. I believe that was back in week 3. So a capital expenditure, I'm on page 337 right now, can be defined by an organization as its capital expenditure policy, and as a result of definitions may vary, if you will, but it usually includes land and all costs associated with acquiring land improvements such as sidewalks, parking lots, buildings, fixed equipment such as plumbing, furnace, air conditioning, major movable equipment. And, that can be many different types of equipment, especially in the health services organization, repairs and maintenance as well. And so all of that has to be accounted for. So if you buy a large MRI machine, not only do you have to budget on how that MRI machine is going to get paid for, what about the repairs and the budget? The repairs and the maintenance of the MRI machine. Of course, you've got technicians that need to run that MRI machine. And so you can see the different types of overlap or the different types of budgets that would be required for just one simple MRI machine. Now, imagine if you've got a dozen of these machines spread out across your entire health system. And certainly we know that there are more expensive machines and MRI machines that are that exist in health services organizations. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So what are these steps in the capital budgeting process? Well, starting on page 339, the book identifies 22 steps in the process. Some organizations follow these exhaustive steps. Other organizations combine them together. But the things that you really want to understand is, why don't we start on 341, where we've got these factors, and we've talked about them a little bit already: the payback period, the net present value, and the internal rate of return. These are probably the 3 main financial indicators that managers use in order to make decisions about money. Remember the idea that we talked about, I guess it's been about a month or so now, that we talked about, opportunity cost, and how no matter who you are, you've got a certain pool of money. And when you spend that pool of money, you do that at the expense of not spending that pool of money on something else. Perfect example. You've got $10,000 here. And of that $10,000, you decide as a household that you're going to repave your driveway and that you're going to redo the landscaping. Well, as a result of you spending $10,000 on that, you no longer have that $10,000 to perhaps change the pipes in your house, or you no longer have that $10,000 to put down on a brand new car, or you no longer have that $10,000 to put into savings for your kids' college fund, for example. That's the idea of opportunity cost. So now that we understand, and that's an economic concept. And so now that we understand that, when managers make that decision, they make it on either calculating the payback period. I'm at the top of page 341 right now, which is the number of years necessary for the cash flow to recover the original investment. In our example, it was $10,000, but problem 15.1 is a real good illustration on how managers would do it on the financial side. Basically, they would take the uncovered costs at the beginning of the year as the numerator, and as the denominator, the cash flow during the year. And you get the number there of 3 1/3 years in order to get back that existing commitment of $10,000. Now, when we say a 1 1/3 or 3 1/3 year, really don't understand that out of context. But if the payback period that the managers needed was 3 years, and when you calculate it, it's now 3 years and 3 months, then the manager would reject that project because it takes too long to recoup that initial investment. And so that's the payback period. How long will it take us to recoup the money? And then that one is actually not used as much as, let's say, on the top of 342, the net present value. And then there's a modified net present value too that gets us a little closer to the number that we want. But for now, we'll talk about the net present value. Is a commonly used financial analysis and capital expenditure that relies on discounted cash flows, whereas the discounted payback period gives the manager an answer in years. The net present value gives the manager an answer in dollars. So a net present of 0 means that the capital expenditure is generating discount cash flows just sufficient to repay back the original investment. But if the net present value is positive, then the expenditure is generating a discount cash flow that is in excess of the amount necessary to pay the original investment. And then, of course, a negative net present value means that the discounted cash flow is insufficient to pay back the original investment. And there's an example on 15.2. Ideally, you want a positive net present value, but even a net present value of 0 may be doable. Again, it depends on the mission and the vision of the project. But you certainly want to stay away from negative net present values, which again is the telltale sign that a manager would certainly be rejecting a project with the net present value. And I'm actually going to read verbatim here. I'm still on page 342. I'm in that probably second paragraph there when it says net present value does have flaws. And most theorists agree that net present value could be superior to the internal rate of return, which we'll talk about next. And as a result of that, the internal rate of return is a common way of evaluating capital expenditures in the real world, but it should be coupled with both the net present value and the internal rate of return. And there's some examples of it right there in problem 15.2. There's a modified net present value. I guess we don't talk about it in this book here. And so on page 344, the internal rate of return is the minimum return needed to break even on the investment. And the investment, again, kind of just like the payback period, right? What is your break even? If you need to break even within 3 years, but then you calculate your internal rate of return and it doesn't have you breaking even until 4 years, then that managers will then reject that project based on a negative internal rate of return. You can also use that internal rate of return to determine the type of financing that you want to get. Do you want to get financing from a bank to fuel your expansion process? If so, you can use the bank's interest rate to calculate your internal rate of return to see if it jives. Or perhaps you don't want to do debt financing, you want to do equity financing where you will sell shares or equity within the organization to raise money. You have to calculate that internal rate of return as well in order to determine what is the best financing method, if you will, in order to finance your projects there. So let's take a look at Exhibit 15.2, where we're looking at financial capital expenditures of healthcare organization, funding depreciations, capital surpluses, and debt to finance capital expenditures. And for managers, it's always a balancing act between where you get the money from in order to finance your capital expenditures, and how long will you use the money for the capital expenditures compared to the cost of the money. Similar probably to the same decisions that you're making here in your college education, determining what the cost of your education is, what your financial sources. Are you going to get private loans? Are you going to get public loans? Are you going to pay for yourself? Which is what I did for my through my undergrad and master's program, was all money out of my pocket. I didn't start getting student loans until I started getting my doctorate degrees. And then what's the payback period, right? Do you have 20 years to pay back your student loan, or you're going to have to pay it back in 10 years? So these are all factors that you have to consider in your own micro financial world that managers have to determine in the micro financial world. And so now we start to kind of get into some of these ratios, if you will, such as the debt to capitalization ratio, decisions on if you want to purchase outright or if you want to do leases on specific capital expenditures, if you will. So just so many considerations, so many factors that we have talked about and that we'll continue to talk about. But for now, I think that's probably enough. So thank you very much. We do have an open session this week, so I'll be logged in to the Zoom session between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. You're not mandated. However, it'll be an open session for anyone that wants to log in and have a conversation about these tough concepts. Thank you very much. God bless you. And I look forward to reading your work in week 6.